Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Archaeology. In this video, we're going to discuss late antiquity. That is, the late Roman Empire, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and then the emergence of the Byzantine Empire. In this video, we will discuss the late Roman Empire from the crisis of the 200s to the division of the Roman Empire into the Western and Eastern Roman empires. Along the way, we'll discuss the archaeological evidence we have to corroborate these historical events. Then we'll discuss the fall of the Western Roman Empire, why the Western Roman Empire fell, and some of the archaeological evidence that we have that elucidates our understanding of why the Western Roman Empire fell. Finally, we'll finish our discussion by discussing Romanesque Western Europe, that is, Western Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And we'll also discuss the Eastern Roman Empire after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, what is often called the Byzantine Empire. And the image on this slide is a painting depicting Ulrich the Visigoth's sack of Rome in 410 CE. It's believed that Ulrich the Visigoth had help from Roman slaves who joined his cause. We'll talk more about Ulrich the Visigoth and the sackings of Rome later in the video. We'll begin our discussion of the late Roman Empire by discussing the crisis of the 200s. The crisis of the 200s took place from about 235 to 284 CE. The immediate cause of the crisis of the 200s was the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander by his own troops in 235. That was the immediate flashpoint that began a series of violent civil wars and military coups for about half a century. The long-term cause of the crisis of the 200s was a mixture of factors. There were financial causes, namely that the Roman system was struggling to pay its military and also to fund its systems of social obligation, which provided for the welfare of poorer Romans. The empire's economy just did not grow through peaceful means. It was very dependent on foreign conquests, the treasure that would be brought in from foreign conquests, and then the captive slaves brought in from foreign wars. When the Roman civilization began to move away from conquest and offense towards defense, there just was not enough wealth coming into the empire, and the economy began to stall, which led to financial issues, which then caused the crisis of the 200s. There's a labor shortage due to a lack of captive slaves, and this labor shortage is especially bad in the mining industry, where most of the mining, especially for gold and silver, is done by slaves. At the same time, though, there's still a high demand for goods and services, even as the Roman economy is shrinking. And that contributes to inflation. And inflation contributes to discontent amongst the Roman soldiers, whose pay did not keep up with inflation. At the same time, from about the 200s on, barbarians, as the Romans would have called them, but we would call them Germanic tribes, were migrating to and into Roman territory. Some of these migrations were more like armed invasions. Others were just gradual movements of people. And they began settling in Roman territory and even joining the Roman military. And also during this 50-year period, in addition to the violent civil wars and military coups, there were plagues, domestic insurrections, natural disasters like earthquakes, and there were, of course, foreign encroachments by the Germanic tribes. Thankfully, the Roman Empire does begin to stabilize around the 270s CE. There were several important military victories by the Emperor Aurelian between 270 and 275, And then the rule of Emperor Diocletian, particularly Diocletian and his reforms, bring the crisis to an end about the year 284 CE. Some historians and archaeologists argue that the crisis of the 200s formed the transition from classical antiquity to late antiquity, although there is some debate about use of periodization. Obviously, periodization is something that can be very subjective. It's something that's created by archaeologists and historians as they study the past. These periods would not have been as evident to people living in the past. For them, it was the present. The image on this slide is a porphyry statue of the four tetrarchs. It was made about the year 300 CE. It features the Eastern Roman Emperor Diocletian, the Western Roman Emperor Maximian, and then the junior emperors of the East and West, Galerius and Constantius I. Galerius being junior emperor Caesar of the East, and Constantius I being junior emperor of the West. And by the way, this statue is in St. Mark's Church in Venice, Italy. This is the Roman Empire around the year 271 CE, right about the time that Emperor Aurelian, who I mentioned on the previous slide, began his conquests. Red represents territory under control of Rome, and green and yellow represent breakaway territories. The Gallic Empire, which includes Gaul and Britannia, and then the Palmyrene Empire, which includes Egypt and a good portion of Anatolia and the Levantine coast. These green and yellow regions are going to be brought back into the empire about the time of Aurelian. These red lines, starting the first line on the left, and then the second line on the right. This period is the crisis of the 200s. You'll notice that there are over 20 emperors in a period of about 50 years, compared to 26 emperors in just over 200 years. From Augustus to Severus Alexander, it's over 200 years. And then from Severus Alexander's death to Diocletian's ascension to the imperial throne, it's about half a century, but yet you have over 20 rulers. So these emperors are coming and going much more quickly. Most of them are meeting some type of violent end, either being defeated in battle or being assassinated. And it's a time of great instability for the Roman civilization. And that's why we call it the crisis of the 200s. Now we'll discuss some of the most famous Roman emperors of the crisis of the 200s. This is Maximinus Thrax. He's the first of what were called the Barracks emperors. He ruled from 235 to 238 CE. He is actually the first Roman emperor who's not from the senatorial or equites or knights class. He's also of non-Roman Gothic and Thracian descent, hence his name Thrax. There's a lot of stories about Emperor Thrax. It was said that he was over 8 feet tall, that he was a very fierce fighter, and that he ate 60 or 70 pounds of meat a day. Some of these were probably folk tales or propaganda made up to make Thrax sound more intimidating. But scholars generally agree that he started out as a low-level Roman soldier and worked his way up to general. He was declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard after the death or killing of Severus Alexander. Severus Alexander had angered Roman troops by trying to bribe Germanic tribes rather than fighting them. Most of the legionaries at this point, and even most of the other troops of the Roman Empire at this point, were stationed on the frontier of Roman civilization, and many of them also came from either the frontier or from non-Roman peoples. So it's not surprising that the Roman soldiers would be more loyal to their general, in this case someone like Thrax, than they would be to the Roman Senate or the Roman state. And Thrax's rule was the first of the Barracks Emperor's rulership. And this is a period often referred to as military anarchy by historians. There's a series of coups, assassinations, violent power transitions are the norm, even more so than other periods of Roman history. And of course, they're called the Barracks Emperors because these emperors generally are military leaders. They're generals with little to no political experience. In Thrax's case, he never actually set foot in the city of Rome. He was defeated outside of Rome, leading to the end of his rule. There were, however, some good things about Thrax's reign. He did invest in infrastructure projects, but of course his reign ended violently with his defeat in battle. And this bust is of Emperor Thrax. It's at the Capitoline Museum in Rome. Its style is sort of a transition between the older classical antiquity or early Augustan imperial portraiture design, and then the later Roman, late antiquity abstract design. We'll talk more about the style of sculpture later in this video. Here's an image of the palace of Thrax in Sirmium, present-day Serbia, not far from where Thrax grew up and came to prominence in the Roman military. This is a late Roman-style golden helmet. Probably would have been worn by an officer found near the Sirmium site. A crest would have been attached to the top of the helmet. You notice the Roman-style cheek plates and neck guard, but you also notice this nose guard, which is most likely of Germanic origin. We'll talk more about how Roman arms and weapons and equipment evolved during the late Roman Empire later in this video. So now we'll discuss some of the archaeological signs or indicators of the decline of the Roman Empire. Some of these developments begin even before the crisis of the 200s, but a lot of them will pick up and accelerate from the crisis of the 200s and beyond. As I mentioned before, there was a labor shortage in Rome from the 200s on, particularly in the mining industry. Mining of gold and silver decreased in the 200s due to a lack of miners, of laborers. Miners were generally slaves in ancient Rome, captives from conquered peoples. During this period, they began to replace slave miners with convict laborers. Prisoners, people who had been convicted of crimes, were sent to work in the mines instead. There may have also been some paid workers who were sent to the mines. And because of this, there were fewer miners to work, and the labor costs of mining increased, so there was a lot less mining during this period. Of course, troops still need to be paid. People are still wanting to purchase goods and services. Social programs, patronage systems overseen by wealthy Romans still have to be funded. So the solution chosen by the Roman government was to debase the Roman currency. What they did was they would mix other less expensive metals with gold and silver, especially with silver, to create more coins so that they could pay people and fund programs and things of that nature. Iron and tin and copper would be mixed with coins, especially with silver, and the coins would be a lot less valuable because of this. This is going to increase inflation, which only makes the problem of paying soldiers worse, as their wages just do not keep up with the inflation of the currency. Debasement does begin to slow down a little bit towards the 280s and even into the 300s, but basically from the crisis of the 200s on, the quality of Roman coins is a lot lower. They are mixed with non-precious metals, iron, tin, copper, etc. This causes not only there's too many coins with inflation, but the coins are of a lower quality. Iron coins will rust, Copper coins will turn green and tarnish. You'll also notice the coins get smaller during this period, and the designs, the busts and reliefs, the heads and writing on the coins, they're a lot less sophisticated. So you can't really use seriation here to date these coins because the later coins are actually not as good as the earlier coins. In addition, these coins are also clipped. Sometimes the edge will be shaved off, and so these coins get smaller, in addition to the fact that they're being minted smaller. And this is pictures of some earlier Roman coins. There's the gold aureus and the silver denarius. The denarius especially is going to be mixed with other metals like iron and tin. Here's a diagram showing the decreasing silver content in silver coins like the denarius. You'll also notice that early silver coins, the bust and reliefs are of very good quality. They're made mostly of silver, 3.9 out of 4 grams silver by the late 200s. The quality is much lower. The bust is not nearly as sophisticated or detailed. You'll also notice that this coin is not nearly as bright. It's tarnished, probably because it's been mixed with most likely some copper in this case. You can see there's a little bit of an increase in coin quality in the 300s, but then after the 300s, it just continues to get worse and worse and worse. But the big drop-off really takes place in the 200s, the crisis of the 200s. Here are a mixture of Roman coins from different periods in Roman history. You'll notice that later coins, the detail tends to be lower. Some of these coins with the Christian symbol, Chi Rho, obviously they're from after the Roman Empire becomes Christian. Their level of detail is much lower than earlier, brighter coins that have a higher percentage of precious metals. Interestingly enough, here's a coin of the Capitoline wolf, part of the story of Romulus and Remus. You see coins with symbols of Roman emperors and politicians. And then you also see, of course, coins with Christian symbols, which are going to come from much later in Roman history. And of course, the effects of inflation were disastrous for the Roman people. This led to increasing taxes, increasing costs of goods. The average Roman couldn't afford to pay the increasing taxes, and they also struggled to buy, basic goods like olive oil and grains of wheat. They almost look like ears of corn, but there was no corn in the Roman Empire. Corn's not going to be brought to Europe until the Age of Exploration and the Columbian Exchange in the 1500s CE. So basically, goods and services, they become a lot more expensive. Taxes are increasing, but wages just do not keep up during this period. And the Roman economy begins to contract. And as the Roman economy begins to contract, the Roman population shrinks as well. It got to be so bad even that in some parts of the Roman Empire, they didn't even use currency during the 200s and on. They would barter and trade. They might trade olive oil for grains of wheat, for example, because the coins were just so worthless. So now we'll mention Germanic settlements in the Roman Empire. Barbarian peoples, as the Romans would have called them, especially the Germanic tribes, they began to settle in Roman territory from the 200s and on. There's actually a couple of waves of settlement of Germanic peoples. There's a wave in the 200s, and then there's a wave again in the late 300s. Many of these Germanic people, Germanic males, joined the Roman military. They served as what were called foederati. The foederati kind of phase out the old auxilia system from earlier in Roman history, but there's a lot of similarities between the auxilia and the foederati. In general, the foederati were more able to maintain their cultural traditions and their military traditions than even the auxilia were. And one of the reasons why so many Germanic people became foederati is because fewer Roman citizens wanted to join the Roman military. There just didn't seem to be much of a draw to join the military. There weren't very many conquests going on. And also, Roman social systems are being stressed. People don't want to put their lives on the line for a system that's not working, that's full of inflation and full of high taxes. All of those things, in addition to a lack of opportunity for conquest, will convince a lot of Roman citizens not to join the Roman military. Should also mention that unlike the auxilia before them, the foederati were a lot less interested in becoming Roman citizens. Mostly the foederati just wanted to live in Roman territory and be paid for their military service. They wanted a lot of the benefits of living in the Roman Empire, but they weren't as interested in becoming Roman citizens. Why would they want to become Roman citizens? The Roman system is high tax, high inflation, not very effective social programs or social programs of obligation. The foederati basically wanted to have some of the benefits of living in Roman territory, but they also wanted to avoid a lot of the downsides of being Roman. And the foederati, they lived on the frontier, very little connection with Roman culture, so many of them were a lot more loyal to their generals, some of whom were Roman, some of whom were of barbarian descent. And this is going to contribute to the military coups and military anarchy and the barracks emperors of the crisis of the 200s. And as I mentioned before, barracks emperors typically had no political or administrative experience, and many of them did not even rule from Rome. And their reigns often came to an end when another general tried to overthrow them or have them assassinated. The foederati, on a more positive side, they did actually have an impact on Roman culture, particularly on Roman military culture. You're going to see that Roman arms and equipment, and even some elements of Roman clothing are actually going to change as a result of these foederati / barbarian influences. This is a mosaic of some Roman cavalrymen from the 300s CE. It's from a villa in Sicily. Cavalry become a lot more important in the late Antiquity, in the late Roman army, as the Romans are struggling to defend their territory. They need to have troops that are more mobile. Cavalry, of course, can cover a lot more ground than infantry can. The downside, of course, is that cavalry are much more expensive to maintain. You need to feed not only a soldier, a cavalryman, but you also need to feed a horse. There were also reports that cavalry were less disciplined than infantry as well, which is what some Roman historians argued. Here are some images of Roman infantry from a villa in Sicily as well. You'll notice that the Roman soldiers are wearing very different clothing. They're not wearing armor in the way they would have in previous periods. The type of Roman armor worn in the early empire was just too expensive, so they wore lighter armor afterwards. They also began to wear longer tunics with these designs, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And they also wore these cloaks and these fur caps. These are believed to be Germanic fashion that Roman soldiers began to wear, and then Roman civilians would begin to wear as well. This is a spiculum. It's a type of javelin used by the late Roman armies. It's believed to be a fusion of the Roman pilum and the Germanic throwing spear. Its design is less sophisticated than that of the pilum. It's a lot shorter, which does make it easier to throw and to manufacture, but it's a lot less complex. The pilum was designed to bend when it hit an enemy soldier's shield. The spiculum is not designed to do that. It's a much simpler weapon, a much cheaper weapon, although it is a much easier to use weapon. And weapons like the spiculum highlight that the Roman military is struggling not only to pay its troops, but to adequately equip them and train them as well. These are Roman plumbata, or military darts. These would be thrown by Roman infantrymen at their enemies. They have a barb on the end of the dart. Along the shaft, there is a weight to balance the dart as it flies through the air. And then on the rear, there is fletching, much like an arrow, which allows the dart to be more easily aimed. And ranged weapons became a lot more important in Roman tactics and strategy from the 200s on, as the Roman armies begin to become a lot more mobile. Here are some illustrations of late Roman arms and equipment. The Roman military is focused on issuing cheaper arms and cheaper equipment. Also, there's an evident Germanic influence in the style of the arms and equipment being used by Roman soldiers. For example, the rectangular scutum shield is phased out in favor of circular shields that are more of a Germanic design. Also, Roman-style armor, the lorica segmentata, is phased out in favor of older chainmail and scale armor, which were much cheaper to manufacture. The helmets also change as well, and there's a Germanic influence on these late Roman helmets. Although there are some Roman features as well, kind of mixed together. Roman soldiers are still armored with gladius swords, but you'll also see that now they're using spiculum, javelins, and darts. Once again, they're becoming a lot more mobile in this period. As far as clothing goes, they begin to wear trousers, something that Romans thought were what barbarians wore in earlier periods. Trousers become a lot more common as more non-Romans are in the military. And even a lot of Romans will begin to wear trousers because they're just a lot more practical. They keep your legs warm. Here are some modern reenactors showing off reproductions of Roman arms and equipment from the late Empire. As you can see, circular shields, you have chainmail, and you have scale armor being worn by the reenactors. The helmets are a combination of Germanic and Roman technological features. Swords are still being used, but now you'll see spears, javelins, bows and arrows. They're a lot more important as the Roman military is becoming more range weapons based. Now we'll talk about another significant Roman emperor from the crisis of the 200s. That is Emperor Valerian. Valerian ruled from 253 to 260 CE. He's actually the first Roman emperor to be captured by non-Romans. He was captured by King Shapur I of the Sassanid Persian Empire after the Battle of Edessa. And this is, of course, in 260 CE. The Sassanid Empire was a major rival of the Roman Empire in the Near East. There's a lot of reports about what happened to Valerian in his captivity. Some reports said that Shapur used Valerian as a step stool to help him get onto his horse in order to disgrace him. Other reports say that Shapur had Valerian killed and then had his body stuffed and preserved to mock him in death. Scholars nowadays tend to think that these stories were either exaggerations or fabrications by Romans, especially by Christian Romans, who would have wanted to make the Persians look like barbarians, but also a lot of the Christian Romans did not like Emperor Valerian because he persecuted Christians. So they may have exaggerated the poor treatment he received as a prisoner of King Shapur. Scholars nowadays tend to argue that actually Shapur would have treated Valerian pretty well and would have treated him as a hostage, that he would not have wanted anything too bad to happen to his emperor captive, because then he could not collect a ransom. Either way, though, Valerian dies in captivity, either in 260 or possibly later in 264. Here is a Persian relief showing Valerian's capture by Shapur. You can see Shapur here on a horse, overlooking Valerian on his knees, begging for his life. It's an interesting piece of artwork because it actually shows Valerian wearing late Roman fashion, as opposed to fashion of an earlier period, like a toga. Instead, he's dressed in a long tunic and a cloak, much more like how Germanic soldiers would have been dressed. It's believed that the figure standing behind Emperor Valerian was actually a previous Roman emperor named Philip the Arab, who actually tried to make peace with the Sassanid Empire. Philip the Arab was not at the same place as Valerian was when Valerian was captured. So it's sort of a work of propaganda by the Persians, showing not one, but two Roman emperors submitting to the Persian king. This is a cameo showing Shapur's capture of Valerian. And here is a kind of zoomed out version of the capture relief. By the way, this capture relief is actually in present day Iran. Here's a close-up of the victory relief. You can see Valerian begging for his life, presumably while previous Roman Emperor Philip the Arab looks on. The art is very interesting on this relief. As I said, Valerian is shown wearing late Roman Germanic influenced attire, and this figure here, believed to be Philip the Arab, actually his face is carved more with what we would say are orientalizing features rather than European style features, which is why some scholars think that this figure is Philip the Arab, a Roman emperor from the Middle East who ruled before Valerian did. We don't know for sure, though, because the inscriptions on this relief have been damaged and cannot be read. So there's a lot of speculation being done by historians and archaeologists with this artifact, this monumental artifact. And here is a rendering illustration of the relief that gives you a better idea of what it would have looked like in its prime. Here are some Achaemenid Persian tombs, much older tombs that are near the victory relief, kind of in a larger site in, as I said, what is now Iran. And you can notice how the tombs are carved into cliffs. This was a style of architecture used by the Persians, but also by the Greeks after they took over the Achaemenid Empire, which you'll remember from a previous lecture video. Here's some information about Philip the Arab, who ruled before Valerian, but I thought I would provide some context about his rule, since we discussed him previously. He reigned from 244 to 249 CE. He's from Arabia Petrea, basically the strip of land between Egypt and the Levantine coast. Philip tried to make peace with the Sassanids by paying tributes to them. He also spent very extravagantly on ludes, festivals to commemorate the 1,000-year anniversary of Aeneas's flight from Troy and the Roman people's genesis. This is, of course, a mythological explanation for the beginning of the Roman people. Archaeologists generally believe that the story of Aeneas of Troy is a myth. but the Romans would have believed that this story was true. Some later Christian authors speculate that Philip may have actually been a secret Christian because he stopped persecutions of Christians during his reign. It's a possibility, but there's not really a way for us to know for sure. Philip was from the Middle East, and the eastern part of the Roman Empire had a lot more Christians, so it's a possibility. He was from a part of the empire where Christianity was more common, and it's true that he did stop persecutions of Christians during his reign, but there's not really any way to know for sure based on the evidence we have now. But our ideas could change as new evidence is discovered. Either way, Philip the Arab was betrayed and killed by Decius, who went on to become the next Roman emperor. And this is a bust of Philip the Arab from the Vatican Museum. It's interesting because it shows a transitional style between late classical antiquity, sort of the Augustan portrait style, meant to be very realistic, to look like the person is being portrayed, and then the later late antiquity, late Roman, expressive, abstract style. I think this piece, though, is more like the older Augustan style of portraiture than it is the later late antiquity abstract style. So now we'll discuss Emperor Diocletian and the end of the crisis of the 200s. Diocletian became the emperor in 284 CE. A little bit of information about Diocletian. He was born in Dalmatia, what is now present-day Croatia. The Balkan region produced a lot of Roman emperors, barracks emperors, general emperors during the 200s. People like Thrax, for example, were from the Balkans. Granted, Diocletian is from the Western Balkans, Dalmatia. Thrax was most likely from the Eastern Balkans. Diocletian divides the Roman Empire in 286 CE. He will take control of the eastern portion, and he also creates a system of junior emperors, or what's called the Tetrarchy, where basically the empires are divided in half, and then the two halves are divided in half between a senior emperor and a junior emperor. Diocletian chose to be emperor of the East because the East was a lot wealthier than the West, and it's estimated that by this point, the East may have actually had a higher population than the West. It's thought that the Western Roman Empire's population fell significantly during the 200s, whereas the Eastern Roman Empire's population held a lot steadier during the period. As Emperor Diocletian, he tried to make the tax code a lot more progressive, meaning he tried to put more taxes on the wealthy and fewer taxes on poorer people. He rebuilt damaged infrastructure, and he also tried to institute price controls to combat inflation. His attempt to institute price controls largely failed, though, and people basically ignored them. He also moved the Western Roman capital to Milan, or Mediolanum, as the Romans would have called it. And also he oversaw what is the last major persecution of Christians. He retired from office in 305 CE due to ill health, and he's been criticized for some of his policies, his price controls, his persecution of Christians, but he's generally seen as being a good emperor who bought time for the Roman civilization, or for the Roman Empire, by dividing it in two. A divided empire was easier to administer and maintain. The Western Empire, of course, would survive for about another 150 years after Diocletian's rule, and then the Eastern Empire would survive for about over another 1,000 years. And this is a bust of Diocletian. It's at the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. You'll notice that the style of this bust is a bit more abstract. It's not meant to be a portrait. It's meant to convey more of an emotion of Diocletian as emperor, of his strength, of his wisdom. And this is going to be something you're going to see in late antiquity. Portraiture is going to be phased out in favor of a more abstract and expressive art. sculpture style. So now we'll talk in more detail about late Roman and late antiquity sculpture. The sculpture in this period is a lot less realistic. It's much more idealized. It's much more prone to abstraction. It's almost impressionistic in nature. They're really trying to convey emotions and ideals with these statues rather than convey a likeness or a portrait of the subject. In this case, it's usually a Roman emperor. These emperors want to convey emotions about their rule and their power rather than what they exactly look like. And scholars will debate whether late antiquity sculpture is less sophisticated than that of classical antiquity, the Greco-Roman style, the Roman portrait style, the Augustan style. Augustan style being portraits that are a little bit embellished. The older styles that I mentioned before, Greco-Roman, Augustan, etc., they're still made during this period, but this new abstract style becomes a lot more common. It's believed that these styles of sculptures are not necessarily less sophisticated. Some people thought that in the past that Roman sculptors were losing their ability to sculpt as good of statues. But nowadays, a lot of art historians, archaeologists, and scholars argue that the goal of sculpture in late antiquity was different. And that actually, in some ways, there were some important developments in late antiquity sculpture, particularly the eyes of the subjects in the sculptures. They get a lot more sophisticated and a lot more detailed, which you'll see. Sculptures of the Augustan period, for example, they were usually the eyes were very plain. They would be painted to give detail. But in late antiquity sculpture, eyes would have their pupils and irises actually carved. So that's actually an element of sophistication. So on the whole, we would say that late antiquity sculpture is not worse or less sophisticated than that of earlier periods. It's just different, and it has a different goal. And this is an example here is the statue of the four tetrarchs. It's meant to represent Emperor Diocletian and the other four emperors who the empire was divided between. We can see Diocletian and his junior emperor, and then we see Maximian, who was the Western emperor, and his junior emperor. And as I mentioned before, this statue is made of porphyry, which is a purple type of stone that was very popular in late antiquity. Purple, of course, represented the Roman Empire and Roman wealth and the power of the emperors. So a lot of statues of Roman emperors during this period are made from porphyry stone. Here are some close-ups of the Tetrarch's statue. You can see that the faces of the four emperors look pretty similar, although two of them have beards. This one has a beard and this one has a beard. It's believed that the bearded emperors are meant to be the senior emperors or the Augusti, and then the clean-shaven emperors who look younger are meant to be the junior emperors or the Caesares, who ruled alongside the Augusti but in kind of a subordinate role. And of course, we get a view of Roman fashion during this period by looking at the statues. They're wearing these fur caps, and then they're wearing cloaks, and they're not wearing togas, for example. They're wearing more like what we would associate with Germanic style attire. Some more close-ups of the faces of these statues. They've been damaged over time. This statue was originally from Constantinople and was moved to Venice by the Crusaders during the Fourth Crusade. At the time, Constantinople was ruled by the Byzantine Empire. But you can see the eyes are very expressive. But you can also see that the actual exact facial features look pretty similar between these two figures. It's just one has a beard and one does not. Once again, late antiquity sculptors were much more interested in portraying ideas and emotions rather than portraying exact portraits. This is a missing piece of the plinth or the base of the statue of the four tetrarchs. It's in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. As I mentioned, the statue was damaged when it was moved during the Fourth Crusade. Some points about Roman men's clothing and fashion in late antiquity. The traditional toga worn during the Republic and early Empire, it fell out of favor in the late Empire and late antiquity. The toga was just said to be too impractical. It was uncomfortable. It was hard to move while wearing a toga. And instead, Romans began wearing long tunics and trousers. Romans of the Republic and even in the early Empire thought that trousers barbarians wore, but as more barbarians were coming into the empire and even joining the military, Romans began to adopt barbarian fashion as well. You also see these sort of pillbox caps, which would have been made of cloth or fur. That's believed to be a barbarian fashion adopted by the Romans. The cloaks are fastened by brooches called fibulae. Fibulae brooches were actually used by both men and women. It's just the style of the brooch would change a little bit if it was a male or female wearer. Typically in this period, beards were more popular for men, although in the 300s CE, the clean-shaven style actually comes back into vogue, thanks to Constantine I. You'll also notice these really intricate designs on the bottom and on the sides of the tunics. These designs were meant to signal a political office or affiliations. They weren't just art for art's sake. They were meant to signal that you were a government official or to signal membership of organizations and associations. And here is a mosaic of two men on a hunt, showcasing late Roman fashion. This mosaic is from the 300s CE. And you'll notice this design here means something very different in the ancient Roman context, much different than it does today. Now we can discuss Roman women's fashion in late antiquity. Hairstyles became a lot simpler. The very complex braids and lifted styles of the early empire really fall out of favor. The hair is worn much more loosely. Clothing worn by women also is a lot simpler and looser as well, but women still will cover their heads in public typically. And the images on this slide, it's a bust of a Roman woman from the 300s CE, and then this is a bust of the wife of Emperor Philip the Arab from about, this bust was made from about between 250 and 300 CE. You will also notice that the faces of these statues are also a bit more expressive. There is still some portraiture, but they're definitely trying to convey emotion with these statues. In late antiquity, the older stola and palla that were worn by women were phased out with looser, more robe-like dresses with very long and very wide sleeves, almost what we would think of as like a medieval style. Although Roman women still wore head coverings outside of the home, there is that kind of continuity. What you see is the styles of women's clothing is a lot simpler in late antiquity. There's reasons for why this may have been. The economic peril that the Roman civilization was in from the 200s and on would have meant that everyone was lowering their standard of living, including the clothing they wore. These looser, wider types of clothing would have been easier to manufacture. It also could be because the Christian population of the Roman Empire is increasing. Christian beliefs put an emphasis on modesty, on wearing clothing that's not very revealing. So that also could be a reason why Roman women's fashion changes. And the images on this slide, this is of Helena, mother of Constantine, and she's wearing what's kind of a transition between the older stola and palla and the later, more flowing dresses. And then these images here are of modern reenactors modeling Roman women's clothing from late antiquity to kind of give you an idea of how women were dressing as well. And there's also the possibility that barbarian influence is having an impact on Roman women's fashion, in addition to Christianity and economic turmoil, making simpler clothing a more popular choice. This is a map of the Western and Eastern Roman Empire, the West being in orange, the East being in green. You can see the Roman capital is moved from Rome to Mediolanum or Milan. Maximian, the Western Roman Emperor, will rule from Milan. His Caesar, his co-emperor or subordinate emperor, junior emperor, will rule in Trier, in what is now Germany. In the east, Nicomedia was the original capital. It was the home of Diocletian. Eventually, Byzantium will actually become the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, but that's going to happen a little bit later. And then Galerius, Diocletian's subordinate emperor, his Caesar, is going to rule in Thessalonica in Greece. And Latin is the primary language spoken in the Western Empire, and Greek is the primary language spoken in the East. Here's another map showing the breakup of territories within the two Western and Eastern wings. The region in green is going to be ruled by the senior emperor, Maximian, the Augusti, and then the yellow portion is ruled by Constantius, the Caesar, the junior emperor in the west. In the east, this pink region is going to be ruled by Galerius, the Caesar, and then the dark purple region is going to be ruled by Diocletian, the Augusti, the senior emperor. This is the amphitheater of Mediolanum, Milan. Milan is the capital of the Western Roman Emperor. It's where Maximian, this is a bust of Maximian, would have lived. This bust is interesting. It's definitely very expressive, very stylized. You can see it's very much of the late antiquity style. Also, one of the reasons that Diocletian may have chosen to move the Roman capital to Milan, a much smaller city, is because during this period, wealthy Romans are fleeing big cities like Rome, and they're settling in the countryside or in small towns. Life in the big cities was not as comfortable for wealthier Romans. There were a lot of poor people that they had to take care of, so many of them left. And also just health in the big cities was not good. Even with all of the Roman public works and infrastructure projects, these cities could be very unhealthy places. Garbage dumps, all sorts of waste and things, a lot of which, the Roman public work systems cannot take care of entirely. So it makes sense for someone like Diocletian to move the capitals around to smaller towns. These are ruins of the imperial palace at Milan. This was built around 291 CE. You can see what the palace would have looked like. It's certainly not nearly as big of a palace as those built by Roman emperors during the Golden Age, during about the time of Augustus through the 100s CE. It's a very nice house, but it's certainly not a massive palace. The likes of which were built early in the Roman Empire. Here's some shots of Trier, present-day Germany, where Constantius I ruled his portion of the Western Roman Empire. You can see the Roman-style brick covered with plaster. The plaster, of course, would have been painted to make the buildings look more decorative. And you can see the many Roman arches as well. This is the Roman Forum of Thessalonica, surrounded by the modern city of Thessaloniki. This is in Greece. Um, and this is a bust of Diocletian's Caesar, his junior emperor, Galerius. This is Nicomedia. It was where Diocletian ruled his portion of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's in what is now Izmit, Turkey, and this is a bust of Diocletian, which is interesting because it mixes a couple of different types of marble. So not every work of sculpture from the later Antiquity period is simple. There is still quite a bit of complexity. This is the palace of Diocletian in what is now Croatia. This was the palace that he retired to after he abdicated the imperial throne. This is what it would have looked like at the time of Diocletian, and it has been heavily renovated and added to during the Romanesque period, right about the 1000s CE. So this is not original architecture. This is what we think it would have looked like at the time of Diocletian. And this is the mausoleum of Diocletian, who died in the year 305 CE. It's been restored and renovated. This is what it would have looked like in Roman times. Here you can see a combination of repairs that have been made, and to get an idea of what it would have looked like when Diocletian was interred in this tomb. Now that we've discussed the crisis of the 200s, we'll discuss the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, how Christianity developed, how it impacted Roman culture, and the role that Christianity played in the development of the Roman civilization. We'll also discuss whether Christianity played a role in Rome's decline and fall as well. We'll start our discussion by looking at Jesus Christ, the figurehead of the Christian faith. We believe that Jesus was a historical figure and that he lived from about the year 4 BCE to about 33 CE. He's born in 4 BCE because of changes to the calendar. In order to make everything add up, they had to move Jesus' birth back a few years. Jesus is the anglicized version of the Hebrew name Yeshua. Yeshua is a very common Hebrew name. And it comes to us in English via the Greek term Jesus. By the way, Jesus' last name was not Christ. If you'd asked him what his last name was, he probably would have said, "I'm Jesus of Nazareth," which was where he grew up. Jesus came in what's called a Jewish apocalyptic tradition. Various Jewish spiritual leaders were very into the idea of apocalypticism and the end of the world, because for the Jewish people in about the time of Jesus' life, it felt like their world was coming to an end. They were taken over by the Romans. They were mistreated and persecuted by the Romans. So a lot of Jewish people wanted a Messiah or an anointed one to save them. And the word Christ is basically it's from Christos, which means anointed one in Greek. That's where we get the term Christ from. Jesus, the anointed one. Or Jesus Christos, Jesus Christ, the anointed one in Greek. The Jewish people living in the Roman provinces in the Middle East, what the Romans called Palestine, they wanted a zealot. They wanted a military leader. Zealot's a technical term for a Jewish military leader who wanted to rebel against the Romans. But Jesus promised peace, and he promised what he called storing up treasure in heaven. That is suffering in this life, self-denial in this life, so that you can have a better life in heaven. So the term Messiah refers to more of a political or a military anointed one, basically a king. a king who would help the Jews gain their independence from the Romans. Jesus was crucified by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate with the support, we believe, of Jewish authorities. The Jewish authorities were alarmed by Jesus' teachings. They were concerned that he would get them in trouble with the Romans. They were also concerned that his principles of storing up treasure in heaven would threaten their own power within Jewish society. So Pontius Pilate makes the decision to execute Jesus. And Pontius Pilate was certainly a historical figure. He's mentioned not only in documentary sources, but with material evidence as well. This stone is called the Pilate Stone. It mentions Pontius Pilate. It also mentions the Emperor Tiberius. And it says that this building was dedicated by Pontius Pilate. It's believed to have been part of a Roman theater that was demolished in about the 300s CE. And by the way, the Pilate Stone is at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Here are some additional facts about the Pilate Stone. It was discovered in 1961, and it's written in Latin, and it mentions Pontius Pilate as the prefect or the leader, governor of Judea. This is the Church of the Nativity. It's in Bethlehem, where Jesus was said to have been born. The church was built in the 330s CE, when the persecution of Christians ended in the Roman Empire. The church you're looking at, however, was rebuilt in the 500s CE by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. It was destroyed in a local Samaritan revolt. And then, of course, it was rebuilt. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Holy Tomb. It was consecrated in 335 CE, so just a few years after Christianity is legalized in the Roman Empire. It was destroyed in 614 CE by the Sassanids. The Sassanids, of course, are a Persian empire. It's believed to be built over Jesus' execution site and tomb. Of course, Christian tradition teaches that Jesus, after being crucified, he was buried in a tomb and rose from the dead 3 days later and then returned to heaven. So you're not going to find a body of Jesus Christ, according to Christians. Although I should mention that it's very common to find skeletal remains of people named Yeshua, because Yeshua was a very common name in first century CE Jewish culture. But devout Christians would say that that's not Jesus Christ that you found. It's just a different person named Jesus. This is the plan and the grotto of the Church of the Nativity. It's set up a lot like a Roman basilica, a long rectangular nave, which Christian congregants would have to process down towards the grotto, sort of the holy place of the church site. While there's a lot of documentary evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ and the persecution of early Christians, mentioned by historians like Tacitus, Josephus, a Jewish historian who was also a Roman citizen, and then Pliny, there's a lot less material evidence for the existence of Jesus. Why this is? It's likely because Jesus lived as a itinerant preacher. He traveled the countryside in Judea, and he did not have very many possessions for himself. He did not have a home for himself for his adult life during his ministry. Also, he came from a poor family as well. He was not a prince or a king, someone who would have left behind a palace or anything like that. Also, Christian tradition holds that Jesus Christ, after he was killed on the cross, he rose from the dead. So he would not have left a body or bones behind to be found. So there's very little material evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ. Christians in late antiquity and the early medieval period, however, they tried to find what they believed were pieces of Jesus Christ's cross, pieces of wood. Although determining the authenticity and veracity of these pieces of wood is very difficult. You could do carbon-14 dating to date them, and then you could do dendrochronology to determine what part of the world the tree grew in, but you would not be able to prove specifically that this was the cross or a piece of the cross on which Jesus died. More dubiously, Christians claim to have found Jesus' burial clothes, or the shroud in which he was wrapped, known as the Shroud of Turin. Nowadays, most historians and archaeologists believe that the Shroud of Turin was a forgery, specifically a forgery made in medieval times. They've done studies on the cloth of the shroud, and its style is much more like that of a medieval cloth as opposed to a cloth made in the ancient world. Also, they've done carbon-14 dating on the tests, or tests of the cloth, and it dates to medieval times, not to ancient times. They've also done tests on the pollen and on this material that's believed to be blood, and all of it indicates that it was made in medieval times. Of course, proving that the Shroud of Turin is a forgery does not disprove the existence of Jesus Christ. It's just, as archaeologists, we are looking at material culture as best as we can, determining when it was created, how it was used, as to what students believe about Jesus Christ, about his life, his ministry, etc. That's up to the students. I'm not going to tell anyone that their beliefs are correct or incorrect as an archaeologist. I'm focused on the material culture and adding to the historical record more than proving or disproving someone's faith. As is the case with Jesus Christ, there's quite a bit of documentary evidence for the persecution of Christians, but there's a lot less material evidence. Roman historians mention persecution of Christians, and they often supported this persecution. They saw the Christian faith as a threat to the empire because Christians refused to worship the emperor, and because they rejected many other Roman cultural and religious traditions. Later Christian Roman historians, that is, Romans who had adopted Christianity, they wrote about persecutions as well, but they're writing hundreds of years in some cases after the events they're discussing. And they give a lot of very detailed and grisly accounts of how Christians died. In this painting here, it's based on Roman Christian sources from later in Roman history. It mentions, they mention Romans being crucified and lit on fire. They mention Christians being eaten and killed by lions and other wild animals. And they mention that Christians were not just persecuted, but they were executed in really violent and terrible ways. And this doesn't seem too unbelievable, knowing that the Romans used capital punishment. They had gladiatorial contests. They had public executions. We might just wonder how extensive the persecutions of Christians actually were. So persecution of Christians did happen. It's just material evidence is a little bit thinner on the ground. Some of the reasons for why there's less material evidence for early Christians and their persecution is also because many early Christians, in fact, in the beginning, probably the majority of early Christians were poorer people, people who didn't have a lot of money. Also, there would have been a lot of women who converted to Christianity early on because Christianity, while it is a patriarchal religion, gave them more opportunities and rights than pagan Roman culture did. Also, slaves would have been drawn to Christianity as well because Christianity taught that all people were equal in the eyes of God, and that would have appealed to people who were in slavery. And of course, all of these groups, poorer people, women, and enslaved people, would have left behind fewer artifacts for archaeologists to find. And on the subject of persecution, it appears that persecution of Christians was not constant, but that it happened in cycles. Christians, along with Jews, were persecuted at certain times, and they were seen as being scapegoats. That problems the Roman Empire was facing was because of the Christians or because of Jews. Events like the Great Fire in Rome in 64 CE were blamed on the Christians, when in fact the fire was probably started by Emperor Nero. But despite these persecutions, people continue to convert to Christianity. The religion grows very slowly, though. It's really not until about the 300s that we think that Christianity really began to explode in numbers, eventually becoming the majority religion in the Roman Empire. Christianity's egalitarian message, that all people were children of God and could become Christians, and then the stalwartness of Christians facing persecution, it seems to have inspired Romans to convert to Christianity. Not in super high numbers, but to some degree. As I mentioned, Christianity really begins to increase in numbers significantly, we think around the 300s, about the time that Christianity is legalized. Another thing that might have appealed to Romans, leading them to convert to Christianity, is that Christian people were heavily involved in charity work, especially in big cities like Rome. They provided food to the poor, and they also adopted abandoned children that had been left out in exposure. And basically, Christian congregations sharing food and sharing with each other, it replaced the system of obligation in many parts of the Roman Empire. As patronage kind of fell apart, Christianity and Christian charity would have taken its place in many contexts. Also, the chaos of the later Roman Empire would have inspired some would have inspired some pagan Romans to convert to Christianity. Christianity teaches that self-denial and suffering in this life will lead to rewards in heaven. Also, early Christians especially believed in the apocalypse. They believed that the world was going to end, probably in their own lifetimes. And seeing the chaos of the late Roman Empire, it would have been really easy to believe that the world was, in fact, ending. So for all of these reasons, many people converted to Christianity, even if there's not very much evidence of early Christians' conversion or of their persecution. We still believe that people converted to Christianity. This is the Alexamenos Graffito. It's a vernacular piece of evidence of Jesus and of really the distrust that a lot of Romans had for Christians. This is from the Palatine Hill in Rome. The inscription is actually written in Greek. It says, Alexamenos worshipped his God. And it shows a person on a cross with a donkey's head, it's believed. Basically, they're saying that this person is worshiping Jesus on a cross with a donkey head. So it's meant to mock not only Jesus, but it's meant to mock, presumably, Alexamenos. Alexamenos, of course, is more of a Greek name. And the inscription is written in Greek, which is very interesting because it comes from Rome, where Latin would have been the dominant language. We have to remember, though, that Christianity spread from the east to the west, and early Christian texts were mostly written in Greek. So it's possible that this piece of graffiti is meant to mock a Greek-speaking Christian person, and that's why it's written in the Greek language rather than Latin. This is a carving of a Christian fish, or ichthus. The fish was chosen as a symbol for Christians to symbolize their faith to each other without being discovered by the Romans. The fish in Greek is also an acronym for Jesus Christ, God's Savior. Iesus Christos Theos Sotare. So you can see the acronym here would have been a way for Christians to symbolize their faith to each other secretly. These are possibly the remains of St. Peter, follower of Jesus Christ and the first pope. There's a lot of difficulties with finding material evidence of the early Christian leaders, just because Christian people have been looking for their remains for thousands of years. And in some cases, the remains that are chosen may not be the actual remains of the people that they believe them to be. And in the case of this skeleton, it's mostly incomplete. The bones shown in dark gray are the bones that have been found, and then the lighter bones are the ones that are missing. For context, St. Peter was crucified. Christian tradition held that he was crucified upside down because he did not want to be crucified in the same way that his Savior Jesus was. And as I mentioned, there's not a lot of remains from crucifixion victims because their bodies are basically left out to expose and be eaten by scavengers. So that could be why there's so few bones found. But it also could be that some of the bones were taken away to become relics. A lot of early Christians collected the bones of Christian martyrs who had been killed by the Romans, believing that those artifacts had spiritual power. So it can be very difficult to do archaeological work related to early Christians because a lot of the remains, for example, are very mixed up, and determining their authenticity can be a challenge. Here are the Christian catacombs in and around Rome. The Christians preferred to bury their dead, to inhume them rather than cremate them. They did not like to burn the dead. This goes back to Jewish culture. The Jewish culture held that bodies should be buried. And so Christians set up catacombs or necropolises where they buried their own dead. And they hid these necropolises, these catacombs, because they did not want Romans to come in and disturb or destroy the bodies of their honored dead. Also, Christians would often hide in these catacombs during periods of persecution. The catacombs also had underground structures attached that were used as chapels for early Christian worship services and meetings. These rituals that were performed at these meetings are called sacraments. Many of the sacraments were actually illegal in the Roman Empire. The Romans did not like, in particular, the Christian sacrament of communion, in which Christians would consume wine and bread, said to become the blood and body of Christ. Because of this, a lot of Romans referred to Christians as cannibals. And these underground chapels are often very ornately decorated with frescoes and carvings featuring Jesus Christ and featuring other biblical figures. This is probably an image of Jesus Christ featuring Alpha and Omega, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, which were meant to symbolize the eternal nature of Jesus. And this image comes from the St. Calixtus catacombs in Rome. And it was probably, this chapel was probably decorated about the year 150 CE. Here's some just close-ups of these catacomb frescoes. You can see the details of the work, not only of the human subjects, but of plant and animal life as well, like these flowers here. Here are some additional shots of catacomb art, just to give you an idea of the skill and the time that these Christian artists put into decorating these tombs, because these tombs were not just places to bury the dead. They were places that Christians worshipped, that they would have gathered together in fellowship, and that they would have hidden here during times of persecution. You can also see the brick overlaid by plaster that's been painted. Here's an image of a shepherd believed to represent Jesus Christ. A lot of early images of Jesus Christ in the Roman Empire did not feature Jesus with the classic long hair and beard that we associate with him today. Instead, they decorate or portray Jesus as a shepherd. because of it was said that Jesus was the good shepherd for humans, that he protected them from evil. Here's a fresco believed to be of Jesus as a good shepherd. It's from the Domitilla catacombs in Rome. Another example of Jesus as the good shepherd. He's shown with without a beard and with short hair, and this is from the St. Calixtus catacombs. Another image of Jesus as the good shepherd. I like this one because there seems to be a sheep or goat that's perched on his back. So now I want to talk about the spread of Christianity. Um, the dark purple shows where Christianity spread in the first century. You can see that it's mostly in the Middle East, the Levantine area and Anatolia, a little bit into Greece as well, and then the city of Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire. It takes a lot longer for Christianity to reach the hinterlands of the Roman civilization and to reach rural locations. Christianity really started as a urban religion, targeting the urban poor, slaves, poor people, women in big cities. And Christian missionaries traveled across the Roman Empire thanks to the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Even as the Roman Empire persecuted Christians and killed them and imprisoned them and did all sorts of other things, which have been documented by historians, it also provided a lot of peace and stability, allowing Christians to travel across the Mediterranean basin. They would have walked along Roman roads. They would have traveled along Roman shipping lanes and ships in the Mediterranean Sea. And so even as the Roman Empire persecuted Christians, it also facilitated the spread of Christianity. Here's another map of the spread of Christianity. As you can see, the earliest kind of Christian centers are in urban areas. Urban centers in the Middle East, and then urban centers in Rome. And it spreads into the rural areas much more slowly. So now we'll discuss Constantine I and the end to Christian persecution in the Roman civilization. Constantine I was the son of Constantius I. You'll remember that Constantius I was the Caesar or junior emperor in the Western Roman Empire. Constantine converted to Christianity. Supposedly his conversion came because he had a vision of seeing the Greek symbol for Jesus Christ, Chi Rho, XP, the first two letters of the name of Christ in the sky. And then he heard the Latin command, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign conquer. XP, of course, is the first two letters, or Chi Rho is the first two letters of Christos, Christ. And Constantine took this advice. He put the Chi Rho symbol on his soldiers' shields, and then he won the Battle of Milvian Bridge in October of 312 CE, in which he defeated his rival Maxentius and took control of the Roman Empire. In 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious toleration to Christians. Remember that Milan is the Western Roman capital at this point. Rome is no longer the capital. Constantine also banned gladiatorial contests in 325 CE, which would lead to chariot races and theater becoming more popular in Rome as Romans flocked to other means of entertainment. Scholars debate Constantine's devoutness and his orthodoxy. They question how serious of a Christian he was. They also question if he maybe believed ideas that Christians would say are heretical. For example, he may have believed in what is called the Arian heresy. The Arian heresy says that Jesus was created by God after creation, while the earliest Christian texts say that Jesus existed in a spiritual form from the beginning of time and then was incarnated as a human later in history. So there's some questions about Constantine's, how serious his faith was, and if he had Orthodox beliefs. Either way, though, there were some big changes that came as a result of Constantine's Christian conversion and then his Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal. This bust here is from the Colossus of Constantine in Rome. It's made in a late antiquity abstraction style, but with a little bit of the older Augustan portraiture style. It has very large, expressive eyes, which is a late antiquity style, but the rest of the sculpture is much more of a portraiture style. Also, it features Constantine without a beard. It's believed that the clean-shaven style became popular again during the reign of Constantine. And this is the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Constantine was moving towards Rome, but he was stopped by the Tiber River. Maxentius was on the other side of the river and had destroyed the bridge. But then, mysteriously, Maxentius decided to build a pontoon bridge to attack Constantine's forces. And his forces were, being that they were on offense, they had a much more difficult time fighting. And they were defeated, and they were forced to retreat across the pontoon bridge, which eventually sunk. And it was a massive defeat for Maxentius that led to Constantine becoming the Roman emperor. And of course, Maxentius had probably more troops than Constantine. He had support from the Praetorian Guard. He was on defense. He could have forced Constantine to attack him across the Tiber River. Yet for some reason he chose to attack and give up his tactical advantages, which some might argue is because Constantine was divinely blessed because he had taken the symbol of Christ and put it on his soldiers' shields. Constantine, by the way, was supported by legions from the northern part of the Roman Empire. Constantine was born in what is now Serbia, and then he spent a lot of his young life actually in Britain, in Britannia. So he was a man definitely of the northern parts of the Roman Empire. Yet he makes Christianity a southeastern religion, his religion of choice. Here are some artifacts showing the Chi-Rho XP symbol. You can see the Chi-Rho symbol here. Crosses were not as popular of a Christian symbol early on, mainly because Christians associated the cross with execution. It would have been like wearing a hangman's noose as a necklace. So this Chi-Rho symbol was much more desirable early on for Christians. This coin shows Constantine with a Chi-Rho symbol on his helmet. And then this image shows Constantine's sons, soldiers, Constantius II, with the Chi-Rho symbol on their shields. You can see it here. And this is a rendering of what the original St. Peter's Basilica or St. Peter's Church would have looked like. It was built between 326 and 333 CE. It's in the Vatican. This church no longer exists. It's been rebuilt and remodeled and renovated many times. It looks very different nowadays, but this is what the model of the Western Roman Basilica Church would have looked like. A long, narrow nave that congregants would have had to process downwards towards the transept, which held the altar, the holy place. So here's a couple of points about Western Roman Christian basilicas. Christians began to build public churches in the 300s after Christianity was legalized. These basilica churches were built in the style of Roman pagan temples with columns on the side like this, and then also with Roman audience halls. So they're using points of reference, pagan temples and government buildings, to build their churches, to make it easier for pagan people to adopt Christianity. And of course, these are long rectangular buildings. Congregants must process down the nave, approaching the transept and the altar. and this would have made it a more familiar type of building to pagan Romans. At these basilica churches, Christians would have gone to worship services, but they also would have venerated the saints. The saints were mostly martyrs, early Christians who had been killed, and veneration of the saints would have reminded a lot of pagan Romans of worshiping the gods. So another point of reference that would have made Christianity more appealing to non-Christian Romans. Also, you have to remember that these Christian Roman people, they lived in, grew up in some cases had been pagans themselves. So as they're developing Christianity as a religion, not only are they trying to reach non-Christian Romans, but non-Christian Roman culture is also going to influence them. And a lot of these Roman basilicas, they would be remodeled during the medieval and the Renaissance periods, as I mentioned before. And so there's really actually not many examples of Roman-era basilicas that have not been heavily modified. One of the few examples of one that hasn't been changed a whole lot is the Basilica of St. Sabina. This is in Rome. It was built between 422 and 432 CE. So it gives you an idea of what an original Roman basilica might have looked like. This is the exterior of the Basilica of St. Sabina. You can see the stone and brickwork, characteristic of Roman architecture, tile roofs. Tile, of course, is developed by the Greeks but used by the Romans. And then, of course, you see the Roman arches as well. And this part of the building has plaster on the exterior. The Romans like to cover brick buildings with plaster and then paint over the plaster. This is a Chi-Rho symbol along with Alpha and Omega. It's from the this is actually from the Lullingstone Villa in Britain. This inscription or this image was probably made between the 300s and the 400s CE. It's possible that this image was meant to be a decoration to show the family's Christian faith, the family who lived in Lullingstone Villa, but it may have also been put on the wall to basically make the Lullingstone Villa a house church. Other families may have come to the Lullingstone Villa to have church services, and this is why the Chi-Rho symbol was added, like a cross in a modern day church. It's interesting, though, to see this Christian symbol in a villa in Britain on the far edges of the Roman Empire. Because remember, Christianity starts in the southeast of the Roman Empire, and it grows fastest in urban areas. Some more of the visual art of the Lullingstone Villa and its allusions to Christianity. There's mosaics of Bellerophon killing the Chimera. This is a classical pagan story, but it may have been reinterpreted by Christian people to symbolize Christianity's triumph over paganism, or basically the defeat of this chimera monster. What's also interesting is this is a very large and expensive mosaic. It would seem, based on material culture, that the Lullingstone Villa residents, they were actually getting wealthier in the 300s and the 400s CE, as a lot of other Romans were getting poorer, which a lot of scholars argue that even as poorer Romans suffered, wealthier Romans did not really want to help them anymore, which is why Christianity grew, because Christianity taught that you were supposed to help the poor. And Lullingstone Villa is believed to have some of the oldest Christian symbols in Britain. And the fact that these images are being found in Britain on the edge of the Roman frontier, it shows that Christianity had spread really throughout the Roman Empire, even if it was more associated with urban centers and with the southeast of the civilization. And here's another image of the atrium mosaic of Lullingstone Villa. You can see the Chimera fight up here. Down here is a image of Jupiter or Jove kidnapping Europa, an important pagan Roman story. Not the kind of story that Christians would like, because it features kidnapping and sexual violence. but yet it's still a part of the Lullingstone mosaic. It's possible that maybe some of the family members living at Lullingstone Villa still maintained their beliefs in paganism, or it's possible that the Lullingstone Villa inhabitants were Christians, but they still believed, or at least liked, some of the old Greco-Roman stories, like Job and Europa. There's also crosses, so it's possible that these are Christian crosses or crosses of Christ. We don't know for sure because the Romans at this point usually did not symbolize Christianity with the cross. Once again, they would have seen the cross as a negative symbol. So there's some speculation that we have to make as archaeologists. There's also other symbols in the mosaic that would have had a very different meaning. These symbols would have meant good fortune. They did not have the negative connotations that they do to us today. And this is just the model of the Lullingstone Villa. The mosaic is in the atrium of the villa. And the atrium, of course, would have been a public space in the house. We've also found skeletal remains at the Lullingstone Villa site. These were remains that were placed in lead coffins and then put in the ground. These were not cremated remains. Christianity does not generally support cremation, at least at this point in history. So the fact that these remains are inhumed, buried rather than burned, is a sign that at least some of the residents of Lullingstone Villa were adopting Christianity, not only in how they decorated their home, but even in their burial rituals. And by the way, Lullingstone Villa was probably abandoned about 420 CE after it was burned down by a fire. This is about 10 years after the Romans left Britain for good. The Romans left about the year 410. So now we'll discuss some of Constantine's other accomplishments. Constantine strengthened the faltering Roman monetary system by putting a lot more gold coins into circulation. We think that he got a lot of this gold from mining and melting down pagan statues. Basically, these temples became property of the Roman state, and a lot of them were dismantled, even though at this point there were still a lot of pagans living in the Roman Empire. It's believed that about the 350s CE is when Christianity became the majority religion in the Roman Empire. Constantine also reconquered territory that had been lost during the 200s crisis, including Dacia. Dacia, of course, is in the Danube River Valley. It's roughly modern-day Romania. He also ruled as a single emperor of both the Western and Eastern Roman empires. And he's considered to be one of the, generally one of the best Roman emperors. And then he probably actually delayed the collapse of the Roman Empire by improving the monetary system, by conquering or reconquering lost territory, and by beginning religious toleration of Christians. And this image is of the Arch of Constantine. It's in Rome. This is a reconstruction of what Constantinople or Byzantium would have looked like. Constantine took the city of Byzantium, which was a Greek colony, and he turned it into what was supposed to be the new capital of the Roman Empire. And of course, it was named after Constantine. You can see some of the public works projects that were begun by Constantine. The original city would have been here, and then this all would have been added later. And of course, the city grew even into medieval times and beyond. This map, I think, is supposed to be from about the 1200s CE. So the original version of the city that Constantine would have known would have been probably to about here. And all of this would have been added much later. And this is Constantine's dedication of Constantinople. It was made the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, but Constantine also ruled the Western Roman Empire. So for a brief period, it's actually the capital of both halves of the empire. But after Constantine's death, the empire is going to be divided again. This is the Aqueduct of Constantinople. It's the longest aqueduct in the Roman Empire, and we believe that it was still being used even hundreds of years later by the Byzantine Empire. So it shows how reliable this aqueduct was in bringing water to the city of Constantinople. This is a part of the Hippodrome of Constantinople. The Hippodrome, of course, was a racetrack for chariot racing. Constantine had banned gladiatorial contests, which made chariot racing a lot more important. And the Hippodrome of Constantinople was expanded by Constantine in the 330s CE. Constantine also oversaw the building of public works projects in other parts of the Roman Empire. These are some thermae or baths, and they're built in Trier, which is now Germany. And of course, they're named after Constantine. So now we'll talk about the Roman Empire after Constantine. We'll look at a couple of examples of important emperors. One is Julian, known as Julian the Apostate. He ruled from 361 to 363. He is the last non-Christian or pagan Roman emperor. He tried to return Roman Empire to its pagan roots. He also loved anything related to Greek culture. So he also kind of wanted to get Rome back to some of its Greek roots as well. He even tried to rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem because he knew it would antagonize Christians. So that's an interesting thing about Julian. He was a Neoplatonist philosopher. He believed in the works of Plato, but he also liked the old Greco-Roman gods as well. He ends up being killed by Persian troops under King Shapur II. So he's fighting against the Sassanid Persians, one of Rome's biggest enemies in the East. And this is a statue of Julian. He's actually wearing a Greek-style cloak as opposed to a Roman toga, showing his interest in Greek culture. And this is from Paris, France. This is a relief celebrating Shapur's defeat of Julian. You can see his body here is being stood over by the king and by the Persian god Mithras and Ahura Mazda, the god of Zoroastrianism. And this relief is in present-day Iran. Another important Roman emperor post-Constantine was Theodosius I, also known as Theodosius the Great. He ruled from 379 to 395 CE, and he is the last Roman emperor to rule a combined, unified Roman Empire. Remember, Constantine unified the Roman Empire. After Theodosius I, what's left of the Roman civilization is always going to be divided between the East and the West. Under Theodosius, Nicene or Trinitarian Christianity, that is Christianity where Jesus is believed to have been a spiritual being who has existed for all time, but then became a human between 4 BCE and 33 CE. That became the orthodoxy of Christianity. It was laid down at the Council of Nicaea. That's where it gets the term Nicene. And this becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire. And this angers a lot of pagans, especially the Senate. A lot of the senators were still pagan. And a lot of wealthy people in rural areas were still kind of clinging on to Christianity. In fact, the term pagan comes from paganus, which is Latin for a country person or a rustic. It's actually kind of a pejorative term in Latin. So as Roman society became more Christian, scholars generally think that Christianity became the majority religion by about the 350s. A lot of Roman gender norms changed in some ways. For example, sex outside of marriage was increasingly taboo. In pre-Christian Roman society, men were generally permitted to have sex outside of marriage, but women were not. In Christian Roman society, sex for both men and women outside of marriage became a sinful act. Also, divorce became a sinful act as well. In pre-Christian Rome, men could initiate divorces, but women could not. Now, in Christian Rome, it became a sinful thing for anyone to try to initiate a divorce. There were also more laws that controlled prostitution and sex work as well, because remember, sex outside of marriage was seen as being a sinful act according to Christians. So in some ways, sex and sexuality were more controlled, but in other ways, they were also equalized. Men had lost a lot of the sexual privileges they'd been permitted to have during pagan times, and they had basically a lot of the same rules that women had to live by. So even though Christianity is a patriarchal religion, in some ways, it equalized relations between men and women in the Roman civilization. What's interesting, though, is even as Theodosius I is making all these changes, making Christianity the official religion of Roman society, he actually, in some ways, maintained a lot of older, you might say, conservative Roman styles. For example, his busts are usually portrayed in a much more portrait-like style, as opposed to the expressive, abstract, late antiquity style. Also, even though he was opposed to paganism and opposed to many elements of older Roman culture, he made a law that said that senators had to wear togas when they were in the Senate and on official business. He didn't like the fact that the senators were wearing tunics and trousers. We also think that Theodosius was trying to replace the old Roman systems of patronage and obligation with Christian traditions of charity and benevolence for the poor. He knew that these systems of patronage were breaking down, and he may have wanted wealthy Christians to instead sort of step up and take care of the poor the way patrons had taken care of clients in centuries before. In the end, Theodosius I is generally seen as being one of the better late Roman emperors, although he has been criticized for making Christianity the state religion. Not only did he make Christianity the state religion, but he also persecuted non-Christian peoples. He banned the Olympic Games in 393 CE, for example. The Romans, before this, when they were pagan, they'd allowed all religions to exist so long as those religions also worshiped the emperor. For Christianity, though, it's Christianity or nothing else. So he's criticized for making Christianity a state religion. And sometimes he's also criticized for massacring rioters in Thessalonica in 390 CE. So he's generally seen as being a better emperor, but he was still imperfect. These are the columns of San Lorenzo, taken from a pagan temple sometime in the 300s CE. A lot of pagan temples were demolished from the time of Constantine through the time of Theodosius. And so rather than just destroying everything, the Romans would take pieces of these temples, like these beautiful Corinthian columns, and they would recycle them into other buildings. These columns were actually built around a church in Milan. So now we'll discuss the fall of the Western Roman Empire. From the late 300s to the 400s, there was another kind of wave of Germanic migrations. They began to settle in Western Roman territory, often by force, and Rome was losing the ability to fight off these tribes. They would allow some of the tribes to settle in imperial territory, and some of these Germanic peoples actually joined the Roman military as foederati, a system we saw back in the 200s. And of course, these Germanic tribes took advantage of the instability and divisions in the Roman political system to take power for themselves. They would support their generals if the general wanted to become the next Roman emperor, or they would settle deep in Roman territory because they knew that the rest of the Roman military could not force them out. To make things more complex, a new migration / invasion of semi-nomadic equestrian people called the Huns began to push on the Germanic tribes from about the 370s. This was a major push factor as well. The Germanic tribes were coming to Rome because they saw the instability of Rome, and they saw an opportunity to get land and serve in the Roman military, but they also were fleeing the Huns. The Huns were skilled warriors, and they invaded the Western Empire themselves, actually, later on, from 449 to 453. And of course, that invasion was led by Attila the Hun. Rome was also sacked by Germanic peoples in 410 CE by Alaric the Visigoth, who we mentioned previously. And then Rome was sacked by the Vandals as well, a Germanic people that had actually settled in North Africa before they sacked Rome. And of course, the sackings of Rome were demoralizing to the Roman people, but Rome's population and its prominence had been on decline for over 100 years before these sackings in the 400s. Remember, the Western Roman capital had been moved to Milan back in 286, and then it was moved again to Ravenna in 402. So when these barbarian groups were attacking and capturing Rome, Rome was not the capital, and Rome's population was probably a lot lower during this period. This is an image of the Vandals' attack on Rome. The Vandals attacked Rome in the 450s CE. You can see Germanic Vandals are also joined by presumably African soldiers that had been recruited in North Africa. The Vandals attacked from North Africa, even though they were originally from Germanic regions. These are ivory plates showing Flavius Stilicho. He was actually of Germanic descent, and he was a rival of Alaric the Visigoth. He was a general and a regent of the young Roman Emperor Honorius, and he was of Germanic and Roman origin, as many military figures were in the late Roman Empire. And he was probably one of the late Roman Empire's, Western Roman Empire's most successful military commanders. But he's executed by Honorius, who believed that Stilicho wanted to actually replace Honorius with his own son, Eucherius, which Stilicho's death, though, was a significant mistake for the Romans, because after he was killed, a lot of the German foederati were attacked and killed by Romans, and that led to the foederati rebelling against Rome and actually joining Alaric the Germanic Visigoth when he sacked Rome in 410. So now we should discuss the Huns, who they were, and what they did. Roman documentary sources describe the Huns as having what we might call East Asian physical features. It mentions them having darker skin, darker hair, and a short stature. For centuries, scholars believe that the Huns were possibly of the Zhongyu origin from Mongolia, based on these documentary sources left behind by the Romans. There's also some similarities between how Hun society worked and how later Mongol society worked in the medieval era. That's, of course, comparative ethnography, comparing two different societies to each other to learn more about them. That's something that archaeologists do quite a bit. We don't know a lot about the Huns' spiritual beliefs or how they viewed society, because they didn't leave written records behind. The written records we have of the Huns are written by their enemies, the Romans especially. We do think the Huns practiced a form of cranial deformation. They bound their craniums to make them look more oblong, which is something that actually the Romans mentioned, that the Huns had unusual shaped heads. We found skulls from Hun people that have deformed craniums. What's interesting, though, is that more recent DNA tests of people believed to be Huns show that some of them actually were of Caucasian and Eurasian origin, that they weren't all East Asian people. So it's led to the question of, were the Huns actually a Caucasian and Eurasian people, or were they actually East Asian? I think the most plausible explanation, though, is that the Huns were probably originally East Asian people, possibly from Mongolia. As they spread westward, they brought people into their culture. They brought Eurasian people and Caucasian people into their culture. And that basically the Huns eventually became a multiracial society. And also there's the question of bias. The Roman authors writing about the Huns would have wanted to make the Huns look as different from them as possible. So they may have tried to make the Huns seem unusual by talking about how they had darker hair, darker skin, and were shorter and had funny shaped heads. So as archaeologists, we have to mix material evidence with documentary evidence to try to find the most unbiased explanation of who the Huns were and how their society worked. And this image here is of a modern reconstruction of what Attila the Hun might have looked like. This image shows him with more Asiatic features and shows some of the weapons and equipment that he would have used, riding on a horse, armed with a bow and a sword. These are craniums that have been deformed, or skulls that have been deformed. This was a practice done by the Huns. These are facial reconstructions done on these skulls. These people were believed to have been East Asian. A term that was used in the past is Mongoloid, but we don't really use that term anymore. It's considered to be offensive, so these appear to be East Asian Huns. This is the mummified remains of a Siberian archer, possibly a Han warrior. We don't know for sure because we don't have written records, but it's possible that this man, when he was alive, was a part of the Han people. And it looks like he has undergone cranial deformation in life, which of course is a hallmark of Han culture. So now we'll talk about the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. Rome had been captured several times by the Visigoths, by the Vandals. The Huns had invaded Roman territory as well. The Western Roman Empire was in a time of serious crisis in the 400s. The last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, which means Romulus Little Augustus, because he was probably only about 11 years old. He was deposed in 476 CE by Odoacer. Odoacer was a Germanic captain who had been serving in the Roman military. Odoacer made himself king of Italy, and unofficially he made himself a vassal of the Eastern Roman Empire. He probably did this to keep the Eastern Empire from then turning around and invading his new kingdom of Italy. By this point, Rome, or Ravenna technically, only ruled Italia and a portion of Dalmatia and Sicily and Gaul. Most of the Western Roman Empire had fallen to various Germanic tribes. Gaul had fallen mostly to the Franks. Hispania had mostly been taken over by the Visigoths. And Africa, North Africa, had mostly been taken over by the Vandals. We believe that Odoacer kept the Senate intact. He probably wanted to use the Senate as a bureaucracy to help him rule his new kingdom. And some scholars might say that really he was just another Roman emperor, but he didn't refer to himself as an emperor, he referred to himself as a king. Something that the Romans originally had hated. The Romans originally hated kings, but at this point they did not have enough strength to resist Odoacer, or they didn't have the will either. So it's generally believed that there were no more legitimate Roman emperors in the Western Roman Empire after Romulus Augustulus. Although later European heads of state will compare themselves to Roman emperors as a way to legitimize their rule. The Holy Roman Emperor, the German Kaiser, the Russian Tsar, they'll claim to be like emperors or Caesars, even though they're not really Roman emperors. Some say that the Western Roman Empire never really fell, and that barbarians basically just became more Roman. They settled in Roman territory. They adopted Latin as a language, creating the modern Romance languages of Italian, French, and Spanish, for example. Or they say that barbarians, in addition to becoming more Roman, Romans became more barbarian, giving up a lot of Roman cultural traditions. And I think this idea that the Roman Empire did not so much fall as that it slowly collapsed and turned into something else is probably the most historically accurate idea, because that's how Roman people would have interpreted the times they were living in the 400s, that it's not so much that their society has a single date on which it fell, as it slowly kind of dissolved and became something different. And this image is a gold coin of Romulus Augustulus. Notice just the low quality of the relief. It's very simplistic, it's not very realistic, and it really shows just the turmoil and chaos that the Roman civilization was experiencing as it was transitioning into something very different in the 400s. This is all a territory that the Western Roman Empire could claim by the year 476. As I mentioned, it's basically Italia, a little bit of Dalmatia, and a little tiny portion of Gaul, and then some of Sicily as well. The Eastern Roman Empire, of course, is a lot more durable. This is Odoacer accepting Romulus Augustulus' abdication. He did not kill young Romulus. He allowed Romulus to live a normal life and actually paid him a pension. It was said that Odoacer took pity on the young man and didn't want to kill him. It's also said that Odoacer was a Christian as well, although he was probably not a Nicene Christian. He was probably an older Arian Christian. Now we can discuss some other reasons for the decline and dissolution of the Roman Empire. It seems, based on archaeological research, that disease was a much bigger problem in the Roman civilizations than we've thought previously, especially in big cities. A lot of scholars think that Roman public works, toilets, bathhouses, even as they help prevent diseases like typhoid and cholera, they also would have spread diseases like smallpox. As people crowded together in these toilets, they crowded together in these bathhouses, they would have spread airborne diseases. And of course, these bathhouses and toilets would not have been very clean by modern standards. Romans did not have germ theory. And also lead pipes. This is a lead pipe, I think, from Britannia. Lead pipes were used to carry water through these cities. And of course, we know what lead does to the human body. There's signs of lead poisoning in human remains left behind by late Romans. So in addition to a lack of conquests, a stagnant economy, inflation, foreign invasions, there were other factors, domestic factors that would have contributed to the decline of Rome. Diseases caused by their public works, lead poisoning, etc. This is a graph showing femur length of leg bones. People get taller right around the year 100 CE, which this period is generally referred to as the Golden Age of Rome. There were several very good emperors in a row. The empire was making conquests against its enemies that were successful, and it was a good time to be a Roman, basically 50 to about 100 CE. After that, really femur length decreases. You see the crisis of the 200s here. People are getting shorter because they don't have as much to eat. This is a shortness versus tallness is generally used as a measure by archaeologists just to study how healthy or how prosperous a society is. Taller people, they need more food to eat. They have to eat a healthier diet. Tall people are usually a sign that a society is doing well, whereas shorter people are a sign that a society is struggling. They don't have enough food to eat. Diseases are more common. So at times of prosperity in Rome, we see there's more tall people. And then at times of difficulty, like the crisis of the 200s, there's people who are shorter. You see that the height goes up a little bit during the 300s, during the time of Constantine and Theodosius I, but then as soon as the later 300s roll around and Western Roman civilization begins to dissolve, people begin to get shorter again. And you ultimately see a lowered standard of living. These are a graph of shipwrecks. Shipwrecks were not a good thing for the people involved. To archaeologists, they're a sign of trade, specifically maritime trade. So when you see a high level of shipwrecks, we know that there's a lot more maritime trade going on because obviously not every ship sinks. And you see that between about 50 and 100 CE, that's where the most shipwrecks are, meaning there's a lot more maritime trade going on in that period than there are in later times. And once again, you see that it drops in the crisis of the 200s. It goes back up a little bit in the early to mid 300s, and it just basically collapses again as the Roman civilization dissolves in the West. We've also looked at late Roman pottery. The pottery in the late Roman civilization is very rough and coarse. It's not nearly as decorated or as intricate as some of the pottery we looked at in earlier videos from Rome. This is a Mayanware, which is very rough. It's got bits of rock and things. It's very cheap. This is what's being made later on, as the Romans just cannot afford to make as good of pottery. So seriation would actually show that, would suggest that less sophisticated pottery is older, but that's why seriation alone as a relative dating method is not reliable. You have to do other types of dating, stratigraphy, documentary sources, and if you do that, you'll realize that this later pottery, which is less sophisticated, is actually more recent. So now there's a couple of questions that people have discussed, scholars and even just regular people who are interested in Roman history. Was Rome's fall actually a good thing? Classicists, people who study Greece and Rome, and then medievalists, people who study medieval civilizations, will debate this point. Classicists, as you might expect, they argue that the fall of Rome or decline of Rome was a bad thing because as the Roman Empire ended, there was a lot more warfare and chaos in Western Europe. The infrastructure of the Romans, the aqueducts, the bathhouses, many of them fell into disuse as the population decreased, as there wasn't enough money to maintain them, and a lot of Roman knowledge and scientific discoveries were either lost or forgotten. Medievalists argue instead that actually Rome's fall might have been a good thing because a lot of Roman institutions had become very oppressive by the 200s. Taxation was very high. Wealthy people were not really helping poor people anymore. Patronage had fallen apart. There were a lot of slaves in the Roman civilization. Early medieval civilizations still had slavery, but not nearly as many slaves. And it's actually, a lot of those slaves may have actually welcomed the barbarian invasions. Even many poor Romans may have, if not welcomed, at least refused to resist the barbarian invasions because Rome was not really offering them anything good anymore. Scholars tend to debate whether late Roman or post-Roman people had a higher standard of living. I think that on the whole, the standard of living after the fall of Rome was probably lower for the average person living in Western Europe. But scholars will debate that. They might say that maybe people were shorter after the fall of Rome, but they had a lot more freedom. They didn't have to pay high taxes. So it depends on how you define standard of living. Originally, the classicists generally won the debate about whether the fall of Rome was a bad or a good thing, whether people had a better life in Rome or after. But in recent years, the medievalists have really begun to gain an edge in this debate. They really are highlighting how the taxation of the late Roman Empire was so oppressive, and how slavery was so important in Roman society, but it was less important in medieval society. Serfdom was a more important form of labor in medieval European society. Either way, though, the population of Western Europe is not going to rebound until centuries later. Particularly urban populations are not going to rebound to Roman era levels until between about the 1500s and the 1800s CE, so really only a couple hundred years ago. Either way, though, many elements of Roman culture did survive the dissolution of the Roman Empire, especially languages. Gaul, France, Italia, Italy, Hispania, Spain, and then Dacia, which is now roughly Romania. The invaders took over those territories, adopted many elements of Roman culture, especially the Latin language, which created the Romance languages. For example, French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese in Portugal. These are all based on Latin. That's why they're called Romance, Roman languages. These barbarian leaders would have done this to legitimize their rule, not only over Romans, but also over their own barbarian subjects. And this will kind of create what's often called the Romanesque period, or like Roman period in early medieval history. The Romanesque period goes from about the 500s to about the 11 or 1200s. But once again, that's a period created by modern historians and archaeologists. It's not a period created by people who actually lived at the time. And the image on this slide is of the Forum of Nerva, 700s to 800s CE, and it basically shows this old Roman gathering place is being used as farmland by medieval Europeans because the population in the cities is so much lower. But at the same time, they don't have to pay the kind of taxes that Romans had to pay. Here are some examples of just post-Roman architecture in the West. This is a Romanesque church in Spain. This one is from about the 800s CE, so it's from a few hundred years after the end of the Western Roman Empire. And then on the right, former Roman city centers and forums were often settled by European peasants who used the areas as farmland. Here's a map of the Romance languages. You can see French, Italian, Romanian, Spanish or Castilian, and Portuguese are these are based on Latin with other words mixed in, but they're mostly Romance languages, mostly from the Latin. So now we'll discuss another important question in the study of Rome. Did Christianity contribute to the Roman Empire's fall? This question was postulated by the famous British historian Edward Gibbon in his multi-volume History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which he published in the late 1700s CE. Gibbon argued that Christianity made Romans less militaristic and that Christianity drew too many intelligent and virtuous Romans into the priesthood and into monastic orders. That too many basically smart Romans were not joining the military, not joining the Senate, getting into politics. They were becoming monks and priests. As monks, they withdrew from society to study Christian spirituality by themselves. As priests, they were not having children. That basically doomed Roman society. I think this doesn't really hold up as a theory because monasticism got started in the east of the Roman Empire, got started in places like Egypt, places that lasted a lot longer in the Eastern Roman Empire. Gibbon was also very anti-Semitic, and he tended to view Christianity as kind of an outgrowth of Judaism. So he was going to be biased not only against Jewish people, but against Christians as well. He was influenced not only by anti-Semitism, but by Enlightenment principles that were generally fairly anti-Christian. And there is some truth to Gibbon's argument about the Romans' decline. He talks about some of the other problems the Romans face. The Roman Empire was already in decline by the 200s CE, when Christians were a small minority of the population. Even though there were Christians before the 200s, the Christian population doesn't really start growing exponentially until about the 300s. By 350 is when the Romans became a majority Christian civilization. I actually would argue that if anything, Christianity and Christians helped to delay the fall of the Roman Empire. They created new systems of obligation to help the poor. They replaced the patron-client system with a system of charity where wealthy Christians would help poorer Christians and would try to convert non-Christian people to the faith and offer them, food and things like that. Also, Christianity would have increased the Romans' in-group preference. They would have united around this new religion of Christianity, seeing Christianity and being Roman as being linked. To be Christian would have meant being Roman and vice versa. And the barbarians that were invading, of course, were not Christian. They would have been pagan, worshiping Germanic gods. Eventually, though, of course, these Germanic barbarians, they adopt Christianity just as they adopt other elements of Roman culture. So I actually argue that, if anything, Christianity helped to delay the fall of the Roman civilization. Another question that's often asked, and this is a question that's asked more by, I would say, general students or general people who have an interest in the Roman civilization is, was Rome on the verge of an industrial revolution before its fall? I would argue yes and no. in some ways, I think the Romans had the engineering and mechanical knowledge to begin an industrial revolution. This is a noria, or a water mill. It's believed to have been built sometime between 350 CE and maybe the 1200s CE. Of course, if it was built in the 1200s, it would not have been built by the Eastern Roman Empire. This is in Syria. It would have been built by Arab people who had taken over the region at that point. But the design for the noria is actually from Vitruvius, who is, of course, a Roman engineer that we discussed previously. Also, this water wheel would have pumped water from this river up into this aqueduct and then sent it into a bathhouse. So it's a very, very sophisticated piece of technology. Water wheels were, of course, a big part of the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s and 1800s CE. This is a steam engine developed by Hero of Alexandria. Hero was technically Greek, but the Romans knew about Hero's steam engine. So the Romans had access to engineering technology and engineering knowledge. They also had access to a lot of the important materials needed for an industrial revolution, namely coal and steel. Coal to power steam engines, and steel, which is a mix of iron and coal to make things like steam engines. They have to be a lot stronger. Iron is too brittle. Steel is much stronger than iron. But the Romans didn't really make a lot of steel. They basically made steel for weapons and armor, and that was about it. They didn't think of making pots and kettles out of steel, for example. So those are factors that would say that yes, maybe the Romans were on the verge of an industrial revolution. The no factors are the Romans didn't seem to have the necessary maritime technology to make the industrial revolution work. The Romans were skilled sailors by the standards of their day, but they mostly sailed in the Mediterranean. Their ships would not have handled very well out in the Atlantic Ocean, for example, which is much stormier. Also, the Romans probably only sailed seasonally as well. During the wintertime, they probably would have stopped sailing unless it was an emergency. And I bring up maritime technology because in the United States, logistical and transportation issues, the difficulty of travel drove industrialization. America's rough topography, its poor roads, led to the creation of things like steamboats and canals and railroads, which were an important part of the American Industrial Revolution. The Romans, however, they could travel across the Mediterranean Sea fairly easily, unless it was a winter storm, and they had their Roman roads, so the Romans might not have felt a need to build things like railroads or steamboats or things of that nature. I think another factor in the no section is Romans did not have a modern banking, investment, and market system to pay their wage laborers and to fund entrepreneurs who could have developed technologies like these or manufactured technologies like these. They relied a lot more on slavery and obligation-based labor systems. Basically, the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s was driven not only by technology and necessity, but it was driven by financial systems that developed in the late medieval period and the early modern period. And the Romans, while they had gold and silver coins, they did not have the kind of banking and investment system that would have allowed people to invest to make new technologies. And of course, necessity is the mother of invention. If the Romans were content with the technology they had, there's no reason for them to invent new technologies. So on the whole, I think that the Romans were not on the verge of an industrial revolution. The final thing we'll discuss is the Eastern Roman Empire, which will become known as the Byzantine Empire. And we'll talk about why the Eastern Roman Empire lasted longer than the Western Roman Empire. This is an important debate amongst scholars and archaeologists. There's several possible answers, all of which I think have some legitimacy. The Eastern Empire was wealthier than the Western Empire, and thus better able to fund its own defense. And I think there's some truth to that. The Eastern Empire had very wealthy regions like Egypt, Anatolia, and Greece, which could have better funded soldiers than the poorer West. Also, the Eastern Empire, especially Greece and the Balkan regions south of the Danube River, are very mountainous. They have sort of mountain barriers that would have kept barbarian invaders out, or at least would have made it a lot more difficult for barbarians to invade and subsist their armies in these regions, because the East does get invaded as well, but the invaders don't do as well in the East as they do in the West, which the West doesn't have the kind of mountain barriers. I mean, there are mountains in the West, but they're not as big of a obstacle. Also, eastern cities like Constantinople were very strategically suited for defense. The city of Constantinople is surrounded by water on three sides, and it has very good walls. This would have made it more difficult for enemies to capture the city. And indeed, Constantinople is not going to be completely captured for good until 1453 CE. Also, the East probably had a larger population than the West by the 300s. Earlier on, the West had a larger population, but it seemed that the Western Roman population either migrated to the East or just died out. And by the 300s, it's possible that up to 60% of the empire's population may have been in the East. Constantinople had probably up to 1 million inhabitants by the 500s CE. Remember, Rome at its greatest height had about 1 million inhabitants. But Rome at about the 500s probably only had about 30,000 people living in the city. It had shrunk drastically. And of course, a larger urban population that's not involved in agriculture allows for the construction of larger armies. Larger armies means a better defense, and thus your empire can survive for longer. And the reason that this data on censuses is very fragmentary is because the census reports after about the hundreds CE, they're very fragmented. There's a lot of missing information. So we don't really know for sure, but we think that the East eventually eclipsed the West in terms of population. And this is another idea that's a theory as well. There would have been a larger Greek and Christian population in the East, and so there may have been different systems of obligation. Roman patronage probably would not have been as important in the East. So that would have meant that people had more of a connection to each other in the East than they would have had in the West. Also, there's evidence to suggest that the enslaved population, the population of slaves, may have been lower in the West as well, not West, in the East as well. But that's debatable just because the census data we have after the 100s is very fragmentary. So there's many reasons why the Eastern Roman Empire was able to survive for longer than the Western Roman Empire. And this is a mosaic of Justinian the First, 527 to 565. It's actually in Ravenna, which was the capital of the Western Roman Empire. Justinian will briefly conquer parts of the old collapsed Western Roman Empire and bring them into the East, but only temporarily. This is Justinian's Eastern Roman Empire at its greatest extent. This is the old Eastern Roman Empire, the heartland of what would become the Byzantine Empire. Justinian captures Italia and parts of North Africa and Spain, but he's not able to hang on to those territorial gains. This is Justinian and his empress, Theodora. The Byzantines, or the Eastern Roman Empire, they really invested a lot in 2D art. They made 3D art, they made sculptures, but they were generally less comfortable with sculptures, probably because they associated sculptures and statues with idolatry. This Eastern Roman Empire was Christian. Here's a rare bust from the Eastern Roman Empire. We think it's of Justinian I, but we don't know for sure. It's in a very kind of expressive late antiquity kind of style. Justinian wanted to recreate the old Roman Empire, and to do this he conquered Italy and parts of North Africa and Spain. He brought a lot of money actually in to the Eastern Roman Empire through his conquests, which allowed him to pay for expensive building and public works projects. But at the same time, though, maintaining this territory that he'd conquered was very expensive, and the public works projects he built were very expensive, which depleted the Roman treasury. This would make it more difficult for Justinian's successors to defend the Eastern Empire against attacks, especially from the east, including the rising Arab Islamic tribes that begin to attack the Eastern Roman Empire after the 600s CE. The conquests and spending while they brought in some money, they also cost a lot of money. And they left the Eastern Roman Empire without the kind of resources it needed to combat what's called the Justinian plague. It was a pandemic that is believed to have been caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria, basically the bubonic plague that would afflict Europe again in the 1300s. The empire was just too stretched to properly deal with the pandemic. In spite of some of these issues with Justinian's policies, there were many important and long-lasting changes to the Eastern Roman culture during Justinian's reign. Decreased use of sculpture, increased use of mosaics, and the Greek language becomes a lot more favored during and after Justinian's reign. Greek had always been kind of the vernacular language of the Eastern Roman Empire, but increasingly, because of Justinian, it becomes the legal du jour language. Justinian created the Civil Law Code, or the Justinian Code, which was a mixture of Christian and older Roman legal theories. And the Justinian Civil Law Code has inspired legal systems across the world. I would say that on the whole, Justinian I was a good leader. He's often referred to as the last Roman because he embodied many Roman ideals of conquest, of giving back to the people, public works projects, even though at the same time Justinian also helped to transition the Eastern Roman Empire into the Byzantine Empire by making Greek a more important language, for example. This is the Byzantine flag. The 4 B's represent King of Kings reigns in the kingly city. The King of Kings is a reference to Jesus Christ, not to the Byzantine emperor, but it's saying that basically Jesus rules in the Byzantine city in Constantinople. And if Jesus is ruling, then it also legitimizes the role of the Byzantine emperor. Here's another shot of Constantinople in the sort of at the end of the late Antiquity period, the beginning of the early medieval period. You can see the old hippodrome where chariot races took place well into the medieval era. You can also see the Church of the Hagia Sophia, which was built during Justinian's reign. This is the Hagia Sophia, or Church of Holy Wisdom. It was built at about 537 CE by Justinian. These minarets were added after 1453 when Constantinople was captured by the Ottoman Turks and Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque. This is the interior of the Hagia Sophia. You can see its domes. The domes are, of course, a hallmark of Roman architecture, but they've been decorated in other traditions. Some of these decorations are not original. They were added by the Ottoman Turks when the church was turned into a mosque. So there's many elements of Roman architecture, the domes, arches, these composite order columns here. There's also some departures from Roman styles. There's a lot more mosaics. Remember, the mosaics were very important to the Eastern Roman Empire as they moved away from 3D art in favor of 2D art. This is actually of St. John. Also, there's little mismatches in the construction. Often there's different numbers of columns on each level of the Hagia Sophia. This was not a mistake made by the architects. Rather, this was actually a conscious decision on their part. The Greeks and the Romans had sought perfection in their construction. They wanted to make everything look as perfect as possible. Byzantine and Eastern Roman architects, however, they wanted their buildings to actually look a little bit imperfect. They did this because they wanted to show that creation was imperfect, but God was perfect. So even though there's many similarities between the Hagia Sophia and Byzantine architecture and art, there's some differences as well, particularly around their understanding of perfection. Here's the plan of the Hagia Sophia. It's much more square than a Western basilica, which is rectangular. Here are some examples of some of the imperfections, if you can call them that, of the Hagia Sophia. There's 4 columns on the first level, but then there are about 6 columns on the second level. And this is designed on purpose. This is designed to show this is creation. It's not God. This is a work of humans, and therefore it is imperfect. It's another piece of architecture built by Justinian. It's the Basilica cistern. This cistern would have held water from rainstorms to give the city extra water beyond what was brought in by the aqueducts. It was damaged during the Nika riots of 532 CE, early in Justinian's reign. So he basically renovated and expanded these cisterns and built some really beautiful Corinthian-style columns and arches in what is basically a giant water tank. These are Gorgon heads or Medusa heads that were placed in the basilica cisterns. It's not clear what their use was. They're placed sideways and upside down. It's possible that Justinian was recycling older pagan architecture and using it in the cisterns, and he was probably putting them upside down to show that paganism no longer had power in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, and he was trying to show that Christianity had triumphed in architecture. But we don't know for sure. This is just archaeologists' speculation. And this is just a plan and rendering of the Basilica cisterns to give you an idea of how large this public works project was. Justinian was building a lot of really expensive public works projects, which would have made his citizens very happy with him, but they were also very expensive. And the high cost would have meant that the empire would have had challenges dealing with other problems, like the Justinian plague or foreign invasions. The city of Constantinople fell on May 29th, 1453, nearly 1,000 years after the end of the Western Roman Empire. Constantine XI, Paleologos, was the last Byzantine emperor or Eastern Roman emperor. He was defeated by Sultan Mehmet II, also known as Fatih Mehmet or Mehmet the Conqueror. Mehmet and the Ottoman Turks, they conquered the city of Constantinople using new technology, especially gunpowder weapons, which they used to break down the walls of Constantinople. And so in the end, even though it lasted nearly 1,000 years longer than the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire did eventually fall. This is all that was left of the Eastern Roman Empire by about the time of the fall of Constantinople. You can see the purple is Byzantine territory, so they have a little bit of territory around Constantinople, and then they have a little bit of territory in the Peloponnesian Peninsula of Greece. Remember, the Peloponnesian Peninsula is where the Mycenaean Greeks lived predominantly, and it's also where Sparta was. So the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self by the time it was officially conquered in 1453. Conclusion. The Roman Empire, like the Greek civilization, would inspire cultural and political systems of many other countries and civilizations, in spite of the numerous problems that the Romans faced from the 200s on. In spite of the problems, other civilizations have been inspired by the positives and achievements of the Romans. Classical civilizations, the Greeks and then the Romans, would form the foundation of what we call Western civilization, particularly after the Roman Empire adopted Christianity. Western civilization is generally thought of as being a combination of Christian beliefs and Greco-Roman beliefs, although there are influences from other civilizations as well, which we discussed in this course towards the beginning. Roman civilization declined gradually due to both external and internal factors. All of the issues we mentioned previously. Internal factors were inflation, shrinking economy, breakdown of the patronage obligation systems, and external factors were they were not conquering territory anymore, but at the same time they were losing territory to invading Germanic tribes and other groups. And there's a lot of documentary and material sources showing how Rome declined. But in spite of this decline, many of Rome's cultural traditions will persist for centuries after 476 and 453, from the medieval and Renaissance periods down to the present. And of course, we can see elements of classical and Greco-Roman culture throughout the world today. This is the statue of Michelangelo's David in Rome, made in a very Augustan portrait style. And then the U.S. Capitol building and the Capitol Dome especially are made in what is called a neoclassical style, based on classical architecture. So even though the Roman civilization collapsed, its cultural traditions and the cultural traditions of the Greeks who came before them would live on to the present. And that is one of many reasons why we study classical archaeology.